Hello and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. So today I wanted to discuss something on a little bit more of a personal note. And I wanted to talk about why I don't practice piano for multiple hours a day. And this is something that comes up a lot with people, especially beginners, who feel like unless they practice for hours and hours and hours, they're never going to be able to compete or keep up. And there's a lot of pressure to, practice for a certain amount of time in a way that's just not realistic for most people's lives. So I wanted to discuss my stance on this, and maybe that'll help give you some perspective as well. Let's get started. So first I want to talk about my piano practice habits. There have been a few periods in my life where I've done a lot of heavy practice, multiple hours a day, but these are usually short bursts of time. So for example, when I've been studying for exams, I might spend, several months doing 3 or 4 hours a day. I've done that in the past, but I don't sustain it past the points of the exam or any other such thing that comes up, like a performance. Aside from that, I've maintained a pretty casual rate of practice throughout most of my life. I've been playing and practicing piano since I was 7, so I don't even want to do the math on that. But in general, it really varies. It's almost impossible for me to give you like a specific amount of time I practice because I don't do the same amount of time every day. What I generally do is fluctuate. There are some weeks when I practice a lot, and then there's some weeks where I practice very little, if any. And in general, it kind of works out to probably between half an hour to an hour a day. That's usually more on like the lower end of the spectrum. If I'm really motivated, I do practice more, but those are for short bursts. So instead of even giving a daily estimate, I might say that I practice for approximately 5 hours a week. 5 to 10 if I'm pretty motivated, much less than that if I'm just having an off week when I'm really not in the zone. So I like to go with the natural ebbs and flows of life. And there are just times where I'm really feeling it and I want to play the piano a lot. There are also times where I feel exactly the opposite. And I don't ever find it overly productive to force myself to practice a lot when I'm not feeling it. I find that my practice sessions are kind of almost counterproductive. I don't make as much progress. They're not as successful. Whereas if I'm really in the zone and I'm really motivated, I retain information better, I learn faster, and things flow more smoothly. So I tend to just go with like the natural waves of life. Now, this would be a completely different story for someone who is a professional performer, who does a lot of stuff like that, or for someone who's going to a conservatory or studying at a music school. Such a person like that would obviously need to practice a lot all the time, but that's not my reality, and that's not the reality of almost anyone that I've ever taught. I've had a few students who have gone on to music conservatories and stuff like that, but for the most part, people play music because they get enjoyment out of it, not because they want to pursue it professionally. So for me, since I'm not going to school, since I have no interest in like public concert performances or anything like that, I don't feel that there's personal value to practice for that many hours every day. To spend a lot of time practicing, I feel like you need a really good reason to do it. And I always make comparisons to exercise, but I think it's apt. So for most people, the benefits of exercise are found somewhere between like 30 and 90 minutes of daily exercise. For me personally, I find that I function best when I exercise between 60 to 90 minutes a day. And I'm not talking like anything high intensity, I'm just talking about like going for walks and stuff like that. If I was competitive, like I was training for a marathon or, lifting or doing things like that, I would obviously want to exercise quite a bit more to keep up with the level. But the vast majority of people don't have personal benefit from going past a certain point in which it benefits your health and mental wellness. So with piano, sometimes I find a lot of joy and a lot of value into really deep focused dives. Maybe I'm like just really into a movie and I want to learn a whole bunch of music from said movie, and I do a lot of practice in a small span of time. That's great, but on a daily basis, I don't find personal value going past a certain amount of practice. Now for me, and this is true of other people too, one of the biggest reasons that I don't find value in practicing for hours a day is because there are so many other things in life that I enjoy doing. And the other day I actually did an exercise where I just sat down with a pen and paper and I wrote down all of my interests, everything that I'm interested in, whether it's activities or just like topics. And my list was huge. I think there was like 60 or 70 things on there. And of that amount, I think like music related interests made up that less than 10% overall of like my general interests. So for me to get so narrowly focused on one thing just doesn't make any sense to my life, and it throws my life out of balance. So for example, I like to read a lot and study a wide variety of topics, anything from like cooking and health and nutrition to like spirituality and yoga and stuff like that. And I love having room in my life to explore these other interests. One thing I also really love to do is conduct personal growth experiments. So for example, in the past, I've done things like wake up at 5 a.m. every day. I've gone all raw for 30 days, not my favorite personal trial. I've gone through the workbook, The Artist Way by Julia Cameron. That was an interesting growth experience. Stuff like doing yoga for a certain amount of time a day, like 90 minutes, and so on and so forth. And I really feel like these kinds of experiences and trials give my life more meaning and value. And I wouldn't have time to do these trials if I was practicing 3 or 4 hours a day. So for me, it's a trade-off. What do I find more valuable? Well, I find exploring my broad range of interests more valuable than becoming hyper-focused on any one particular thing. I mean, and then there's the reality of working. Like, I teach a lot of kids piano and I make these videos, and I also like having home-cooked meals, so I spend a lot of time cooking and doing things like hanging out with my husband. I really like reading books at night, and I love having an hour or two in the evenings where I can just like hang out with a good book. And these are the kinds of things in my life that I refuse to compromise on. I refuse to spend less time with my husband because I'm practicing so much piano. I refuse to not read books because I'm practicing so much piano. Because I'm not singly focused on piano, I also have to accept the reality that if I'm ever going to be a piano master, it's probably not going to be till I'm like elderly. And that's okay, because that's not why I practice. For me, practice is about the value it brings to my life at the moment, not for some perceived end goal. If I don't enjoy the process of practicing because I'm throwing the rest of my life out of balance, then is it really worth it to become like a so-called piano master? And to me, that's an easy answer. Of course not. A while back, I recorded a video called something like "Assume that you're gonna become a piano master." And this was all about shifting your mentality when you're practicing, not necessarily about becoming a piano master. And I want to be really clear about that. I don't think that most of us care if we're ever a master, but I think it helps to practice piano and approach music from the perspective of someone who is a master. So when I practice piano, I want to be really effective. I want to practice as though I'm a piano master and I know like all of the ins and outs and the best ways to practice. That's not to say that that's my ultimate goal. My ultimate goal is to enjoy life. There's one more note I want to make in this video, and that's on the subject of effectiveness. So a lot of people think that to be a really good piano player, you have to practice for hours and hours and hours. But what I find is that there's a certain, you kind of hit like a certain point with your brain where you just stop retaining information, because piano is really mentally demanding. And most of us have probably experienced this when we're practicing. At some point, it's like our brain stops working properly. We lose our sharpness. Things become much more dull and we don't retain things quite as well. And I feel like once you've practiced a certain amount of time in a day, you kind of start not working backwards, but it's almost like there's a peak effectiveness that then starts to decline if you practice a lot. So I'm personally skeptical that, say, 6 hours of practice is largely more beneficial than 3 hours of practice. It's probably a little bit more beneficial, but if those 3 hours are really good, I don't think that an extra 3 hours would be as strong or sharp as the first 3 hours, just because it's so demanding. Chopin is a good example of someone who didn't advocate for heavy practicing, and I really connect with his viewpoint on that front. Here's a quote from one of his students, Madame Dubois, who said, "One day, Chopin heard me say that I practiced 6 hours a day. He became quite angry and forbade me to practice more than 3 hours." Another student wrote, "He always advised the pupil not to work for too long at a stretch and to intermit between hours of work by reading a good book, by looking at masterpieces of art, or by taking an invigorating walk." The reason I wanted to sit down and share all of this with you today is because us piano players can face a lot of judgment from other piano players, and it can create uncertainty. Because if you think that all of your piano playing peers are practicing for hours and hours and hours a day, it could make you feel really pressured to do the same and inadequate if you're not. And that creates a lot of stress, and then it's less fun to play piano, and so on. Like there are beginners out there who think that they have to practice for hours a day because that's what other people do. But I've seen tons of beginner piano players and intermediate piano players, and very few of them practice at this concert level. It's not the norm. There's just, you know, people who talk about it a lot on the internet. Ultimately, practice a lot if that's what you want to do. Practice a little if that's what you want to do. I think it's best to go with the ebbs and flows of inspiration when it comes to that, because you want piano to be a sustainable and enjoyable part of your life. You don't want it to be something that you work really, really intensely on for 3 months and then burn out and quit it forever. In theory, you want to be playing piano 20 years from now, or at least I assume you do. Again, if you're a professional or a music student, none of this is really going to apply to you, but the vast majority of us are not. So I think that it's important to find the right balance for your own life when you're trying to figure out how much that you should be practicing. You should practice enough that you feel like it gives you lots of value. It amps you up. But there can come a time where if you're losing time in other aspects of your life, like you have to make sacrifices, then maybe you want to scale it back. So who cares if X person is practicing 6 hours a day? If that's not for you, that's not for you. What is going to be the thing that makes you happy? What is going to set your spirit free? Is it 6 hours a day of practice? Is it 1 hour a day of practice? Is it kind of random amounts, sort of like I do? That's up to you to figure out. But don't let other people shame you into practicing for many hours a day and feeling inadequate if you don't. Chopin himself is no. So instead of even giving a daily estimate,